Okay, I want to do a tutorial that specifically targets the implementation of menu items integration with JCB. We have used this specific component, sermon distributor, many times to demonstrate stuff, and it's mostly because it actually has so many of these features that we are looking for already built into it. So if you don't have the sermon distributor package, you can go to this import JCB packages and you can select it from this list as one of the packages, sermon distributor, and then get the package. If you don't have the key, you can click on this link here, which should take you to a page. Let's see. Yes, it should take you to this page, and it should show you how to get your free key. So you can get free keys for all these. This is the normal way to do it. You click on this get package and then install it, and you should then afterwards get a success message and here see that it's been added. This is so that you can see how we did it in JCB itself. Okay, there's a difference between the component and the JCB implementation of how we built the component, because the component is completely built in JCB. Now, there are a number of things to consider here, because so let's go to a place where we have deployed this component, sermon distributor, and we look at some of its functions. Okay, so one of its core areas is the option to look at a preacher. When you open a preacher, it usually loads all the sermons of that preacher, obviously with PicNation, so you can scroll through it and easily find other sermons. But you can see here it has a series column, a category column, and so you could go to the sermon directly. So we have an item link here, we have another option, a series link here, we have a category link here, and it's all on the page of the preacher, which is an item. And you can click on this category link. This will take you then to this category, where you can then view not only the sermons from that preacher but other preachers in the same category, which is quite nice. And again, we see a link back to the preacher, we see a link to the series, and we see PicNation here, so we can move up in this lineup of sermons. So it's functioning quite nicely. If we go back to a preacher and instead select maybe a series instead of a category, we'll see that then there is again a category link and back to the sermon, preachers. So we got category links, series links, preacher links, and everywhere we've also got the direct link to the specific sermon, where you can then play the sermon, download it. So it has its own page, which also has its own smart URL here, and all of this is happening in this component sermon distributor. So I felt like that component is clearly demonstrating this idea of linking automatically very powerfully. So let's see. In the back end, there's no strange things. We've got a bunch of categories. So here are all the categories. We've got the series, and then you've got sermons and you've got preachers. So they are on different tables, different views, and when you actually set up a preacher, you can a sermon, which is the central piece of our puzzle. You can open open a sermon. Yeah, this we're not using that folder. You can open a sermon and you can link it to a category and to a series. It can even have tags. So I'm not going to go into the tags in this. I'm basically going to work about the category and the series and the sermons and the preachers to show you how to set up these front-end links, that they work very well, like we see it actually demonstrated here. So it's working very well, and I'm sure this is what you're probably looking for. Okay. So first of all, we need to look at the side views, because this is what we've been looking at on the front end here of this website. When we actually click on any of these, like this preacher here, we are looking at a side view, okay? And we need to understand how this side view comes together here. So there's preachers and there's preacher. There's two side views. And there's all preachers, which is a dynamic get, and there's a sermons by preacher ID, also a dynamic get, which gets links to this the side view. So looking at this side view, we are looking at this side view here. If we open it up, we see that it also has a preacher custom get, a number of sermons, preacher ID, number of downloads, preacher ID. So if we look at the top here, this value, that value, we're getting it from another source or query, if I could use that, and also this information about the preacher itself. So you must understand that it's segregating the query. This one here is getting a list of sermons based on the preacher ID. So we're going to look at that, or this whole list of sermons are returned based on the preacher ID. And we're using it as the main get, which means it's the predominant factor within the build of the model and the controller and the side view. Okay. You can obviously look at how we implemented this. We're using some templates, which really makes the code much more easily to read and follow. Otherwise it gets quite bulky. Okay, the idea here is we want to see how to build the search engine friendly URLs, right? How to build the links. So we're going to go out of the side view and we're going to go to this dynamic get instead. So again, going down to preacher and then going to this dynamic get, which is the main dynamic get. You could go to it another way, but this is sort of a shortcut. So we're using a backend view sermon, and we're just selecting this list of values. And then in the tweak, we're using the JRequest. Probably need to change this to the better implementation, but it's still the old way of getting it. It still works at the moment, as you could see, but we need to change that. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is we're using the access level, and we are using the JRequest get int ID, and we're adding it to the preacher. Now I was thinking, let's also look at the code once we've done looking at this, which is produced. Then we have a joint value, which is the series and the preacher and the statistics, and we're also getting the Joomla category. This is important, so that you can see the value of the categories in a cat ID. And let's see, then what's most important for you to see is that I'm building the links in the model before we even get to the view. So I'm building the link to the actual sermon, I'm building the link to the series, and I'm building the link to the category. I'm using the helper route, get category route. Now I'll show you where this code is found in the folders, in the files, so you could see where it comes from. And of course you need just to have a slug for each of these, and it will work quite nicely. Now a slug is usually the ID of the item with its related alias. If you're not using an alias in this item, I would suggest, if you want search engine friendly URLs, that you would in fact implement an alias, because you need unique naming here in this alias. Okay, so that's how we set up the slugs, and this is how we then get the actual link, which is what we are looking at, right? We are looking at how to get this link to exist. And so that's where it happens. It happens here in the dynamic get. I'm using just a loop here, make sure we got the items, and then we loop over them. All this code you can go look at, of course, because you've imported the custom the sermon distributor code. Okay, let's go out of this one. Okay, so here I opened the preacher site. So in the site view, which is directly components, sermon distributor, models, preacher. I've opened this model, and we can now go and look at the get list query, and we will see down here where we are getting the JRequest int, adding it to this value, and then linking it to the preacher. So that is how by ID the area knows what to get. So it does it all over here. Okay, that's the code. So you could actually install it and actually have a look at the code itself, so you can see. Remember, the main objective is getting all the sermons related to the preacher, so it's not just getting the preacher. Now, to get the preacher itself and its values, we decided to use a custom get, right? So here's the statistics of the sermons, here's the preacher, the custom get, and it is also using the ID, the same value, to get the preacher, because the preacher ID is which we're passing to this area. So we're using that, and the number of downloads, all of this more or less the same. So you can look at all that. That's how we get the values here on the page. Okay, now we want to also look at the receiving categories and category areas. I was thinking that might also be helpful. But before we do, there's something more to this which is probably not obvious, and I've done tutorials about it in the past, but it seems to get lost within all the explanation. So let me show it to you here again. So excuse me for those who may know this. In the options area, we actually have a bit of a workaround. Now, probably Joomla is advanced. I haven't actually revisited this implementation to see what will be the better path, but I think there has been a major improvement in this area, and we would probably implement that going forward for Joomla. Okay, I'm in the wrong place. I should be here. In the actual sermon distributor options is what I need to show you. There is a tab for sermon, there's a tab for preachers and preacher categories and category list, and so we basically added customization per area, per site view, because these are all different site views. Sermon is a site view, preachers is a site view, preacher, so forth. Okay, so in the sermon area, we chose to make the sermon menu the preachers. Now, you may not realize that, but in the site view, if you change take everything away and just say A, it actually opens a list of preachers. So this A value here is the preacher menu, preachers menu. So if we were to look at our menu, to give you this perspective, where are we here? Let's go one back. Another one. See, this is the category. We'll look at that as well. Here's the preacher, and here it's called preachers, but that is only if we go to the hidden menus. Where are we now? We were in the hidden one, not in the main. We were, it's the same. Let me just a moment, let me check this out. Of course, sorry, I missed it previously, but there you see the alias for preachers is A, and the sub alias is featured preachers, which is a sub alias, whereas in the main menu we have just preacher, and these are all aliases. So if we go to our menu, you'd see in the bottom here of the screen, the corner, if I hover over it, it shows featured preacher, whereas if I go here, it okay, it also, okay, because this one is a featured preacher. Let's use one that's not. So there's just preacher, a preacher, and the name of the person. So you have this linking that bounces off this A for our. So in our menu structure, if I go back here, for sermon, that's the key, the most central piece. We used preachers. For preacher, we didn't have to set one because we set a menu for it itself. For the sermons, we don't set menus, right? So that one goes directly under the preachers. This one, the preacher, we also did preacher, but categories, or rather category, oh, we did preacher again, and series, oh, we did preacher again. Okay, so there you go. That is how we implemented the category. So for each one, we set a menu. For the series, we set a menu. For the categories, we set a menu. And for the preacher, we set a menu. And we set them all to the same preachers. Now, I'm going to show you this again in a moment, because you need to know the naming convention of this field before you can understand how it actually gets used. This naming convention is quite important of the field. And I'll show you that in a moment when we go back into the code. But that is how we in the component set up a workaround so that our URLs come out correctly. Okay, let's do that. Go back to dynamic get. Where are we? There. And then I'm going to, this time instead of using preacher, let's use category. So if we open the category field and we are getting a sermon, so we are getting a sermon. Wait, let me see, sermons. It's a list view. So this is when you open a category and you want all the sermons of that category. This is its joint implementation. You can go over that. And here is, again, we're using just the get int, which also, but this time we're mapping it to the category ID, which is now the ID being passed, right? Again, we go into the model and we see that again we are creating slugs for the series and the preacher, and again we are building our links in the model with the get sermon route, get preacher route, get series route, And it's in this area where I'm wrapping it in the JR route, which makes it SEO and everything nicely. Implement all of that for you. But it's in this code which you'll see where the menu item field, which we just looked at, this item field, where it comes into play. It's actually at this moment right here that it is going to be used. And based on the function, it will be either this or the other. We'll see that. So how to get the Preacher link series, and we are now in the categories or the category sermons view. So if you go to the website, it will be the same as going category character of God, and here we are. So it's a featured category, a category of God, A, featured. So because we made everything to be the preachers as the menu, that's why it fell back to that. So here's the links we just looked at, the preacher link, the series link, and as you can see, it's all search engine friendly and works very well. Okay, now let's look at the code. So on the front end of the component, this means the site area, you go to the helper folder, and there is a file called router, and double click on this one and to open it, and you would go to the very top to see here is the get sermon route, and here is the get preachers route, and here is the get preacher route, and here, so you see all the routes are here. Now when you look at one of them, we're basically just checking whether there's an ID, because it could fail. If there's no ID, we fall back to no ID, but it shouldn't happen. Even if there is a category value, this implementation is still a little bit shaky, but it should work if you want to pass category value to it as well. But we are just passing a slug to this value here. So here we are just passing a slug, we're not even using that one. And then we use this thing called find item, and this needle was built up here. So here we added the ID to this array, whereas we're passing it, and there is a type. You see the type here? This is quite important because that's going to affect your naming of the fields we spoke of. What fields? Just to be on the same page, this field. So if I do inspect, you'd see that this one is called sermon underscore menu, sermon menu. This is JForm, it doesn't need to be considered, just the sermon underscore menu. So that is the naming convention, and in the code we just looked at, we saw it saying sermon. So it's actually going to target that specific value now. So if we now look at the function get item, there is some attempt to actually detect the item, menu item, before falling back to the default. But if no menu item can be found, over here we check, do we have a type? Yes, we do. Okay, so we get the components parameters, and we use the type, which in this case would be sermon underscore menu, and we try to get the item value. And if it exists, so if you in your component set up this value in your global configuration, it returns that item. So it doesn't go into this area here, which would end up returning the component, and what you'd see by default is happening right here. So if you want to control the item, so you want to put modules around stuff, and you want to control what shows on the page, then this is how you do it. You use this implementation. It's written for you, so all you need to do is basically add the field and when you install the component, go select a menu, and this menu must be related to the component. It can't be another component's menu, unfortunately. The controller is not that smart. So it needs to be a menu item that belongs to the same component. It can be any of its menus. So let's look at what that would mean. Let's go out of here. So when we create the component here in JCB and we are adding the site views to the component, so we go to component and we go to site views. We are saying we want preachers, and it add a menu for this one. So I can actually create a menu item for preachers. Add also a menu item for this one, and we will look at this one. This is how you target individual IDs. We're going to look at that. So preacher, add a menu item, add a menu item for category. So you could see I just added menu items, and then for some I didn't. For example, for sermon, I didn't add a menu item, but you could, but you need to do some other preparation as well. Just adding the menu item won't be enough, and I'll show you in a moment why. And then we have also got this API, which is still a little primitive, but it does work. Okay, point here being we are having this little switch to add a menu item for the site view, which then results into the following, that you can actually, if you think about preachers here, you can actually go and in your sermon distributor you can select preachers or preacher and get a menu like this, and then that we get this sermon distributor overriding concepts of how we want to style the page and stuff. It all gets added automatically, which is all part of this implementation, sort of indirectly, but it is there. And it's really done by, if we go back to sermon distributor, the config area of the sermon distributor component, it's really done over there with a whole lot of configuration fields. So we're going to look at that and also look at some fields to show you exactly how it's done. JCB has moved along since its initial implementation of this, and so there is more than one way to do some of these things, and I must be honest, I'm not working with this every day, and although I know it works, even if someone asks me, I still need to go and check it out again. Okay, so we have this tab here, and that's important. The tab must have the same name, exactly the same name. Where are we? As the site view. If it's not the same, then it won't work. If you give the site view a add menu switch like we showed you, and you want to target it with custom values and configuration stuff, this is critical that so we're looking at preachers. You see that the name here, preacher and preachers here, plural, is the same here, preachers, plural, and preacher, singular. And you see these different values coming up in the config and in the menu area. I'll show you some of the fields here to get a bit of an idea, but this is the request ID. If you want to get an ID selection option, so here we want to sermon preacher, we want to be able to select a preacher. So we can look at this one first. We want to be able to select, we add, because we're in the preacher view, we want to be able to select a preacher. We add this request ID option. So going back to the fields here, And let's see if we type in preacher. Okay, so we got preacher here. Sermon preacher. I think we can look at that one. Let's see if there's more. Here it is. Request. Sermon preacher request ID. So we open that one. So this one, okay, this is just a normal list of preachers. Again, an area which we need to work on if our preachers go beyond 3,000 or 4,000. These selection lists become very slow. Okay, so here with the sermon preacher, we got preacher request underscore ID. That's the name of the field, and that's what is needed to get the field to be. If we go to the site again, and I close this one, which is the plural, no ID needed, but I go open the hidden menu and I open a preacher, you'd see that we've got a list here, and I can select a preacher, and we still have our option to adjust this preacher's outcome. I'm just using global for everything, but you could adapt a specific preacher's view. And it's this field here. This field is built by this field. This is the field used, so you can even check it here. It's in the sermon distributing public. It's being used in the config area. Okay. So that means this convention, this part here, that request word needs to be there, the ID word needs to be there, and the table name of this specific ID, which in our case we know is preacher, and also the name. This should be the same name as the actual view, so they need to be the same. Preacher. Okay, that needs to be the same. Then it's able to identify, the JCB is able to identify that this is a selection field and blah blah blah, and actually adds it to the area. There's another switch which we're not even using here, but we'll probably find it used in some of the other fields. So let me open one of those. So let's see, switch sermon categories, switch sermon preacher. We can check out this. So there is an extra field. Yeah, you see, this is an old implementation. This is when JCB was still in its first set of shoes, and it still works. So again, we just need this to be the same name, and this convention here is somewhat important. But there is a new implementation which adds the display property to this area, and with the display property, you then, with either adding the word config or menu, can decide whether this should show only in one or the other of the JCB implementation. If you're adding this field to the config, you can decide whether this is only a menu field or whether this is only a config field, or leave it out and then it's both. That's the current implementation. So this field is considered to be valid in both area. So sermon preacher, if I go back to the site view menu and I go out here, oh well, I was actually in the right place, my apology. Sermon, what is the field doing? whether the open button should show, whether you can go directly to this actual open button. So I had to go out. It's actually in the different place. It's in the category. Menu type is a category, and we're selecting the link here is the sermon. Let's close this. So we see that in the category area, sermon category, if we open it up, we are having a value here, show sermon open. So it's this field that we are been looking at. It's probably not the best choice, but it still communicates the implementation of having a field that is both in the menu item, and if you go to the overall configuration of the component, that same field is also here in the configuration. So you have a global value and you have a per menu override option. And this is all done by JCB out of the box, simply by adding the field, in this case category. We scroll down, here it is, category sermon open. We just added the field here, and you can go open sermon distributor and check every field out. You can take the name from here and search it and find it, open it, look at it, see where all it's used, look at its implementation, and realize that this specific implementation, followed as close as you can, will produce the same outcome. Obviously you're changing this part here and that part as needed. I mean, this is just so that I can keep my mind in order. Sort of, this is doing the following. So it's more like, it's not like the ID. The ID one is very critical that it be exactly the way I showed you earlier. Whereas this one with the extra fields, it's not as critical. It's more a, so with the ID, you need this request value there. You need the ID value, and it should target the side view correctly. Whereas the others, the naming convention is more sort of for coding on the front, being easily able to know which values we're working with dynamically. Okay, so that is how we get the ID selected in a menu item. So if we go back out here and we think about, for example, apostasy, we see that we selected serieses, we've selected apostasy, and it has said that, and here is our overriding options, which is the same as seen in the global configuration. Now, while I was demonstrating this, I found that one of my fields are broken. As you may know, we've recently made a change to JCB to implement the category field more correctly towards the Joomla implementation. And so I had to come back here, and it still had the S here because of this field. The S was not removed. I sort of forgot about that. So just taking this away, making it a singular view name, is part of the change we had to make. That would fix the problem. So what was the problem? When I selected category, there was no option to select a actual category. Now, because the database wasn't changed, I could close this and the front end of the site would still work. So we saw that earlier even. It still works because the ID is still correct, and all the other code in the component was automated by JCB, so it was fixed, but this one wasn't. So I need to just quickly fix that. First by fixing it in the field like I was showing you a moment ago, then compile and install it back to the website. But just that you know, the Sermon Distributor JCB package is still shipping with the wrong field. So it's this one here. So in your package you go to Sermon category request ID, this one, and you do the same as I've done by just changing this from there to that. That's it. That's all you need to change to fix the problem, and save and close. I have now done it in the core Sermon Distributor package, and will soon enough push out those changes. And I've installed it and refreshed my menus, and if I open this menu now, it will show the options of the categories again as expected. So it was just that small change in the categories that we had to. In your case, you shouldn't even have this issue, because unless you have been having or working with a component for quite a while, but if you're just building a new component, this will just work as it should. Okay, that is looking at how to connect to a specific item. Both preacher and sermon and series are done in the same way. So it's basically just a naming convention, request ID, which you add to the component's configuration fields. Okay, you just add it there, and the same place as the side view, and JCB will automatically know, okay, this is for you to be able to select an ID. So how does that translate to the code? So first of all, in the backend, if we open the config file and we do some overview here, we're going to see, let's see here, this is the UIKit part, Sermon custom config, folders, add to buttons. See, there's a whole lot of fields being added to the config XML. But the field that you will not find here is the request field. So if we were to search for request, it's not here. So it shouldn't be in this file. But if you close out from this one and then go to the front end, and open one of the views, so in our case preacher, you would find a default XML file here. If you open that, you'll see that there is a field being created with the name preachers as the type, and the ID is there, and that's really it. And then obviously the parameters and all the fields that which you set correctly to be part of this menu. There is tutorials about this menu thing, very I think more than one, so you could search through the tutorials to see more about that. But this is the important part, this field here that was added as part of the request name field set. So that is what JCB did, because it found the word request in the field and the word ID. Now if you don't want to use the word ID, you want to use another, you could change it, but just then in your model you need to know that you're using a different value in the URL, because that's what will be used. If you look at the menu, where are we? We open this up, we see this value ID here. That's where that ID is used, and then this is the value selected. Okay, so that's done automatically. I hope this is helpful. I've shown you the code for the controller. I've shown you the code for creating the links. I've showed you how to add it so that you can target a specific item. I've showed you how to do a list of items. We've looked at the dynamic gets. I really hope this covers the topic well enough. We're already at 45 minutes, so probably have to cut out here. It gets too long. It's hard to remember everything anyway. Okay, so let me know in the forum, or probably if there's a problem, and refer back to the issue which was opened, and then we'll deal with it there. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.